Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to create a proper interact input action, and in doing so we're also going to learn about a very powerful C# feature called events. Okay, so here we have our game, so we have the player, and if we move towards the counter, yep, we are correctly identifying it and interacting with it. Except of course we don't want the interaction to happen automatically, it should be on a player input. So let's make our interact action. Let's go inside our player input action, so let's double click on it. And let's make a brand new action. So we've got the move, and now we're going to have another one. So let's click on the plus icon. For this one, let's call it interact. And for this one, action type, we do want it to be a button. Okay, great. Then on the default binding, let's go into path, let's listen. And by default, let's bind it to the E key, just like so many games. So let's go ahead, select this one. And once again, let's make sure to save the asset and let the C# class be generated. Okay. Now over here in our game input script, in order to listen, that is very simple. So we go inside the player input actions, then inside the player action map, and then we can find the interact action. And then over here, we can see a whole bunch of events that we can interact with. We've got these three: canceled, performed, and started. These are the three phases of every input. Again, I cover these stages in detail in the input system video. The important thing is that these are C# events, which I also covered in another dedicated video. Essentially, they are a way for how you can write code to then get notified when something happens, rather than running code on every single update, constantly testing something. For example, over here on the movement is a pretty constant action, so it does make sense to ask the input on every single update if any movement is pressed. But for an action like the interact, the player is only going to press that, say, once every 5 seconds, so it makes no sense to constantly check for that action on every single update. Instead, we just want to be notified when that action is triggered, and that is exactly what an event does. Again, watch the dedicated video to learn all about C# events in detail. They are insanely powerful, and we will be using them more and more as we go through this course. For now, here are the absolute basics. Events have publishers and subscribers. The publisher creates and fires the event when something happens, and the subscriber listens to that event and gets the listening function called when the event is fired. Now on the generated C# class, we've got these three events. The one that we want for this case is the performed event. So let's go into this one, and basically we want to add a listener to that event. And we can subscribe to that by doing plus equals, so this assigns a listener to that event. And now Visual Studio has a nice shortcut, so if we press on tab, yep, there you go, it automatically creates the function. Now if you're not using Visual Studio, you can just manually write this function. The only thing you need to make sure is that the function signature perfectly matches the event signature. As usual, we can inspect the event, so we can right-click on it and go to definition. And yep, here is the definition. And you can see that this is an event of type action with a callback context. Action is what is called a delegate. I also have a video on delegates if you want to learn more about them in detail. For now, we don't really need to worry about what is a delegate, we just need to use it. So in order to subscribe to the event, we need to make sure that this one returns void, because an action returns void, and needs to have a parameter of this type, callback context. If I erase this parameter, yep, there you go, now we have an error because the function signature does not match. So it always needs to match the exact same signature, okay? And also one more note over here, when subscribing to the event, make sure you only add the function name, meaning you do not add parentheses. We do not want to call the function, we just want to pass in the function itself as a reference. Okay, so now when the player presses the interact action, it's going to fire off this event, which in turn will call this function. So over here, let's do a debug.log just to see what this contains. For example, let's print out the callback context. Okay, so let's see. So here we are, and if I press on E, yep, there you go, I've got a nice event. Okay, great, so with this we know when the player presses the key. Now the next step is, how do we get the player class? How do we get this one to know when this is performed? And the answer is we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to make an event over here on the game input class, and the player will listen to that, which in turn the game input grabs from the input system. Again, the whole point is separating our concerns. So the player does not care about the input system, does not care about the interact action, it only wants to know when something related to interact happens. So over here, let's make that nice event. First of all, let's make it public because we want the player to access it. Then we need to add the event keyword. Next, we add the delegate type. Like I said, you can learn more about delegates in my dedicated video. You can create your own custom delegate for your event, or you can just follow the C# standard and just use the standard event handler. And this one exists inside system. So let's make sure to go up here and add using system. And this one has the event handler class. This one is pretty much the C# standard for events. As you can see, it returns void, it has an object for the sender, and an event args parameter. Like I mentioned in the events video, you are not forced to use this delegate. You can use whatever delegate you want. Like for example, you saw that the performed used an action delegate. So you can use anything you want, it's just that the event handler is the C# standard, so it's easier to follow. Unless you have a specific reason to deviate from the standard, you should probably use this one. So let's use this, and then finally for the name, usually you start the name with on, and then whatever happened. So in our case, let's go with on interact action. Okay, so we have defined our event, and now for firing it, let's go down here into when we have the interact performed, and let's go into the event, and for firing it, it's pretty much exactly the same thing as calling a regular function, so we just call it with parentheses. Then usually for the object sender, this is a reference to whoever is sending this event, so usually the this keyword. And then for the event args, this is in case you want to send some arguments with the event. In our case, we don't really need to send any extra data for this one, just firing the event is going to be enough. So for that, we can use the constant event args.empty. Okay, so that's it. With this, we are firing an event. Except just like this, we're actually going to have one potential error. If we have no subscribers, no listeners to this event, then essentially this field will be null, so this one over here is going to trigger a null reference exception. Let's do a quick test just to see this happening. So here, if I press on E, yep, there you go, we have a null reference exception. So when working with events, you need to first test if there are any listeners, and only then do you actually trigger the event. So you do if this one is not null. If it is not null, that means there are some subscribers, so we can fire the event. So like this, it will work, but there's an even more compact way to do this, which is perfect for events. So instead of this, we've got our onInteract action, then we can add a question mark. This is called the non-conditional operator. Basically, the code is going to execute from left to right. And then when it gets to this question mark, it's going to evaluate the left side. And if it is null, then the execution will stop right here on the question mark and will not throw any errors. Whereas if this one is not null, then it continues executing to the right. Except with this syntax, we have an error. We cannot put parentheses directly after the question mark, but what we can do is simply just call invoke, and that does the exact same thing, that calls a function. So what we have here is exactly the same thing that we had previously. So what we have over here and over here, these are the exact same thing. It's just this one is much more compact, and especially for events, this one is super useful. Okay, so with this, we are correctly firing for our event. Now let's actually listen to it. So let's go over here into the player class, and let's listen to our event. Let's do it on a private void start, make it on start and not on awake. This is a very important rule, which I'm actually going to cover in detail in the next lecture. But for now, just make sure to listen on start and not on awake. So over here, we access the game input. Then let's access the onInteract action event. And as usual, let's listen to it. So let's use press tab to listen to it. So it is exactly over here that we want to run our interact code. So let's go down into the handle interaction code that we had previously, so this one. So let's copy paste all of this code, put it up here. So we get the interaction, go into the object and trigger the interact. Now obviously code duplication is a big no-no. So we're only duplicating our code just for a quick test, just to make sure it works. Once again, refactoring is super useful, so we're going to refactor this code to get rid of code duplication in the next lecture. But for now, we just want to test to make sure that this does work. So let's just remove the interact over here from the handle interactions. So the only interact function being called is over here when we have our actual input. So let's test and see if we can press to interact with the counter. Alright, so here we are, and as I move around, if I approach the counter, yep, there you go, we no longer have the automated interaction. And now if I'm facing the counter and I press the interact key, yep, there you go, here we have our nice interaction. Alright, awesome, so I can approach, I can interact and do whatever I want. Alright, so here we learned about C# events. These are super powerful, so if this is the first time you're hearing about them, then you've just added an awesome new tool to your toolbox. Definitely make sure you watch my dedicated video to learn about them in more detail. Events are super useful. The next thing we're going to need is just a visual to highlight the current selected counter, so let's do that in the next lecture.